In the vast sweep of military history, there are certain battles that stand out as turning points, moments when the course of history pivoted on a single engagement, when the outcome of a single day of fighting determined the fate of nations and the future of the world. The Second World War was a conflict shaped by dozens of such battles, from the first shots fired in Europe to the final surrender on the deck of the Missouri. But there are 5 battles in particular that historians point to as the true turning points of the war, the moments when the momentum shifted and the outcome became inevitable. These battles were not just military engagements, they were the hinge points of history. At each of these battles, the course of the war pivoted on the skill and courage of individual soldiers, on decisions made in the heat of combat that could not be undone, and on the accumulated weight of months and years of preparation and sacrifice. Today, we are going to explore 5 of the most decisive battles of World War II, 5 battles that changed the course of history and shaped the world we live in today. Each of these battles was a moment of crisis, a moment when the fate of nations hung in the balance, when the courage or cowardice of individual soldiers could change the course of history. In the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany stood on the verge of total victory in Western Europe. France had fallen in a matter of weeks, the British Expeditionary Force had been driven from the continent in a humiliating evacuation from Dunkirk, and the German war machine appeared unstoppable. The fall of France had been a stunning blow to Allied morale, and many in Britain feared that the island nation would be next. Hitler was confident that Britain would negotiate a peace settlement, and he was unprepared for the determination of the British people to fight on, even without allies on the continent. The only obstacle to a German invasion of Britain was the Royal Air Force, and Hitler launched a massive air campaign to destroy it. What followed was the Battle of Britain, a 3-month air battle that would determine the fate of the war in Europe and perhaps the fate of the entire world. The battle was fought entirely in the air, between the German Luftwaffe and the British RAF, and at its height more than 1,000 aircraft were engaged in combat over the skies of southern England. The British pilots who fought in the battle became national heroes. At the height of the battle, RAF pilots were flying as many as 5 or 6 sorties a day, returning to their bases exhausted and wounded, only to climb back into their cockpits for another mission. The strain on the pilots was enormous, and by the end of the battle, many of the most experienced British pilots were dead or wounded. The new pilots who replaced them were often barely trained, thrown into combat with just a few hours of flight experience. Yet they kept flying, because the alternative was defeat, and defeat meant the end of everything that Britain stood for. The battle ended in September 1940 with a decisive British victory, the first major defeat of the German war machine, and the first time that Hitler had been forced to abandon a military objective. The British victory at the Battle of Britain was not just a military achievement, it was a psychological triumph that changed the course of the war. It proved that the German war machine, which had swept through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with devastating speed, could be stopped. It gave the British people hope that they could survive, and it gave the United States time to begin rearming for the war that was to come. In June 1942, 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy faced a Japanese fleet that outnumbered it by a significant margin in the Pacific. The Japanese plan was to invade Midway Atoll, a small island in the Central Pacific, and to lure the American fleet into a trap where it would be destroyed. But American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval codes, and they knew the Japanese plan before it was executed. What followed was the Battle of Midway, a naval engagement that has been called the turning point of the Pacific War. The battle lasted 4 days, and when it was over, the Japanese had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and more than 300 aircraft, as well as many of their most experienced pilots. The United States had lost 1 aircraft carrier and 1 destroyer. The Battle of Midway broke the back of Japanese naval power in the Pacific. The Japanese lost not just 4 aircraft carriers but also more than 300 of their most experienced carrier pilots, men who could not be replaced in months or even years. From that day forward, the Japanese were on the defensive in the Pacific, and the initiative passed permanently to the United States. In the summer of 1942, the German Wehrmacht launched its summer offensive with the objective of capturing the Soviet city of Stalingrad and securing the oil fields of the Caucasus. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal and most decisive in the history of warfare. The fighting in the streets of Stalingrad was among the most intense of the entire war, with both sides suffering enormous casualties in close-quarters combat that reduced the city to rubble. But the real turning point came in November 1942, when the Soviet armies launched a massive counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army inside the city. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe for Germany, as the Sixth Army, cut off from resupply, was slowly starved and frozen into submission over the winter of 1942 to 1943. The German surrender at Stalingrad in February 1943 was the first major defeat of the German Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, and it marked the beginning of the long retreat that would end in Berlin 2 years later. The Battle of Stalingrad was the bloodiest battle in the history of warfare. More than 2 million people were killed or wounded in the 5 months of fighting, and the city was so completely destroyed that it had to be rebuilt almost from scratch after the war. In the summer of 1942, the British Eighth Army faced a German-Italian army in the western desert of Egypt, at a small railway station called El Alamein. The British were pinned against the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression, with nowhere left to retreat. If El Alamein fell, the road to Cairo and the Suez Canal would be open, and the entire Middle East and its vital oil supplies would be in German hands. What followed was a battle that has been called the turning point of the Desert War. The battle was fought in 2 phases, in July and October-November 1942, and when it was over, the German-Italian army had been defeated and was in full retreat. The British pursuit continued all the way to Tunisia, and by the spring of 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa had been forced to surrender. The Battle of El Alamein opened the road to the Mediterranean and paved the way for the Allied invasion of Italy. The victory at El Alamein transformed the British Eighth Army from a force that had been repeatedly defeated by the Germans into an army that could march across North Africa and eventually into the heart of Europe. In the summer of 1943, the German Wehrmacht launched Operation Citadel, a massive offensive against the Soviet salient at Kursk, in western Russia. The battle that followed was the largest tank battle in the history of warfare, with more than 6,000 tanks and 2 million troops engaged in combat across a front that stretched for more than 200 miles. The Germans committed their best tanks, including the new Panther and Tiger tanks, and they were confident that they could break through the Soviet lines and restore the offensive on the Eastern Front. But the Soviets had built a massive defense system, with layer upon layer of trenches and fortifications, and they had concentrated a huge number of troops and tanks in the salient. When the German offensive stalled in front of the Soviet defenses, the Soviets launched a devastating counteroffensive that drove the Germans back and never stopped until they had reached the borders of Poland. The Battle of Kursk was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, and its failure marked the end of any hope that Germany could regain the initiative in the East. From Kursk onward, the Germans were on the defensive on every front, and the only question was how long they could hold out before final defeat. The battle was not just the largest tank battle in history, it was the battle that ended any hope of German victory in the East. The battles we have explored today are not just the stories of military engagements, they are the stories of turning points in history, the moments when the future was decided in fire and blood. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that the German war machine could be stopped. The Battle of Midway broke Japanese naval power in the Pacific. The Battle of Stalingrad broke the back of the German Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The Battle of El Alamein opened the road to victory in the Mediterranean. And the Battle of Kursk ended any hope of German victory on the Eastern Front. Each of these battles was a hinge point of history, a moment when the outcome of the war could have gone either way, and when the outcome was decided, it was decided forever. The soldiers, sailors, and airmen who fought in these battles were ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who placed themselves in harm's way for causes that they believed in, and who changed the course of history in ways that they could never have imagined. Their courage and sacrifice deserve to be remembered, not just as historical facts but as human stories of individuals who risked everything for a cause that they believed was right. These battles were won and lost by human beings, by young men and women who faced extraordinary dangers and made extraordinary sacrifices. Their stories are the human stories of war, the stories that remind us what is at stake when nations go to war. If you found these stories as compelling as I did, hit subscribe and drop a comment below. What do you think was the most decisive battle of World War II? And what do you think the world would have looked like if the outcome had been different? I'll see you in the next one.